Welcome to episode 36 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Today we'll be discussing Latin text location starting at approximately line 1048 and continuing through 1104, which is near the end of Book 2. And today Elaine will read the text for us. So let's join the discussion for today.
Now turn your mind, I pray, to a true reasoning. For a truth wondrously new is struggling to fall upon your ears, and a new face of things to reveal itself. Yet neither is anything so easy, but that at first it is more difficult to believe, and likewise nothing is so great or so marvelous, but that little by little all decrease their wonder at it. First of all, the bright, clear color of the sky and all it holds within, the stars that wander here and there, the moon and the sheen of the sun with its brilliant light, all of these, if now they had come to being for the first time for mortals, if all unforeseen they were in a moment placed before their eyes, what story could be told more marvelous than these things, or what that the nations would less dare to believe beforehand? Nothing, I trow, so worthy of wonder would this sight have been. Yet think how no one now, wearied with satiety of seeing, deigns to gaze up at the shining quarters of the sky. Wherefore cease to spew out reason from your mind, struck with terror at mere newness, but rather with eager judgment weigh things, and if you see them true, lift your hands and yield, or if it is false, gird yourself to battle. Now I should be glad to know, since without the walls of this world, the visible heavens, there lies an infinite space, what is contained there? This the mind desires eagerly to search into, and by its own vigor to range over freely and without obstruction. And first, since there is no bound to space in any part of it, on no side of it, neither above or below it, as I have proved, and the thing itself proclaims it, and the very nature of space confirms it, we are not to suppose, since the space is infinitely extended every way, and the seeds innumerable fly about this mighty void in various manners, urged on by an eternal motion, that this one globe of earth and the visible heavens only were created, and that so many seeds of matter that lie beyond do nothing, especially since this world was made naturally and without design, and the seeds of things of their own accord, jostling together by variety of motions, rashly sometimes, in vain often, and to no purpose, at length suddenly agreed and united and became the beginning of mighty productions of the earth, the sea, and the heavens, and the whole animal creation. Wherefore it needs must be allowed there were in many other places agreements and unions of the seeds of the same nature with this world of ours, surrounded as it is with the fast embraces of the heavens above. Besides, since there is a large stock of matter already, and a place suitable, nor is there anything or cause to hinder and delay, things must necessarily be produced and come into being. Now, since there is so great a plenty of seeds that all the ages of men would not be sufficient to number them, and the same power, the same nature remains that can dispose the seeds of things in any other place by the same rule as that united in this world of ours, we must needs confess that there are other worlds in other parts of the universe, possessed by other kinds of inhabitants, both of men and beasts. Add to this, that in the universe there is no species that has but one of a sort, that is produced alone, that remains single and grows up by itself. But whatever species things are of, there are many more individuals of the same kind. This you may observe in the animal creation. This you will find to be the state of the wild beasts, of the human race, of the silent fish, and of the whole brood of birds. By the same reason, you must own that the heavens, the earth, the sun, the moon, the sea, and all other beings that are, do not exist singly, but are rather innumerable in their kind. For every one of these have a proper limit fixed to their beings, and are equally bound by the general laws of nature, with all those whose species include a numerous train of individuals under them. These things, if you rightly apprehend, Nature will appear free in her operations, wholly from under the power of domineering deities, and to act all things voluntarily and of herself without the assistance of gods. For, oh, the undisturbed bosoms of the powers above, blessed with sacred peace, how they live in everlasting ease, a life void of care. Who can rule this infinite universe? Who has the power to hold the mighty reins of government in his hands over this whole mass? Who likewise can turn about all these heavens, and to cherish all these fruitful globes of earth with celestial heat? Who can be present at all times and in all places, to darken the world with clouds, to shake the vast expansion of the serene heavens with noise, to dart the thunder and often overturn his own temples, to fly into the wilderness and furiously brandish that fiery bolt which often passes by the guilty and strikes dead the innocent and undeserving?
Thanks for reading that, Elaine. That was a lot of text, and several of those sentences were extremely long, but you did a great job reading it, so I appreciate that. We're closing in on the end of book 2, and so we're sort of coming to some summary passages, and so we're going to be out today from under the detailed discussion of how the atoms come together and coming to some higher level conclusions, it looks like. But I particularly appreciate, Elaine, that you read what we read as the first passage today. We touched on it last week as well, but it's always been one of the most memorable passages in the book to me, the part about the newness of certain arguments and how you should react to those and either embrace them if you agree with them or reject them if you don't. It's a sort of a general paragraph that could be inserted just about anywhere in the book, but it seems to me very poetic and very important for those people who want to assert that Epicurus is a dogmatic philosopher who simply wants to believe what he says. This is one of the best evidences, I think, that that's not the case, that he's telling people to always test what they consider to be the truth before they embrace it. Somebody else.
Martin.
Yeah, I mean, some of them is a repeat from maybe book 1 or much earlier. I don't really have a comment right now.
Charles?
Elaine briefly touched up on the dogmatism from the first section that she read of last week's text, but I'm not sure if it's been brought up too many times before. Maybe I just don't remember it, but this is, at least so far, the most upfront or most obvious text talking about other worlds and other life.
Yes, I started to call this our Star Trek episode because we are really into...
While I was reading, that's what came into my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. And so as you expect, it's one of my favorites. And not only the introduction about rejecting or embracing new truths, but I guess that's the equivalent of boldly going where no man has gone before.
Yes. New life and new civilizations.
That's right. Go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say, we talked about Star Trek before with the gods, which are briefly touched upon here.
Yeah.
But the passage we have after the opening here, talking about how nature never creates only a single thing of its kind, that's apparently the concept that's termed isonomia by some of the commentators.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be a very important one for the development of, or Epicurus' viewpoint on evolution of life, not only on Earth, but also in other planets. That the same things that have happened here on Earth can, because of the evidence that we see that they've happened here, that itself is evidence that it could happen other places as well, and probably does. Appears to be his reasoning here.
So I see why you wanted to read that first, the last section that y'all did last week, and then connect it with this one, because it just reminds us that if we're trying to consider ideas that are maybe really new to us, to think about how you get used to seeing things and don't really question them. You don't think about them anymore. You think you've got it solved. So it's important to kind of start over again and think about your previously unquestioned assumptions before you go on building new understandings. And this is one of the most poetic sections again. He's gone back into that kind of mode, which is real interesting how he kind of goes in and out of the poetry.
This particular paragraph is one that, to me, that he could almost have put this at the very beginning of the poem. It really is a very high-level summary of the position that Elaine just said, that we come to take for granted all sorts of things that we should not take for granted, that we should be willing to question. And at the same time, because he believes in knowledge and that it's possible to know at least a certain number of things, then you certainly are going to, some part of what you've accepted to be true is true, and you should embrace that truth and work with it. And so just because something comes to your attention for the first time does not necessarily mean that it's either true or false. It's got to be examined.
All right, so yes, I can read the Stallings. Now I need your full attention here. A revolutionary thing strives hard to reach your ear. A new side of the universe struggles to come to light. For no fact is so simple, we believe it at first sight, and there is nothing that exists so great or marvelous that over time mankind does not admire it less and less. Behold the pure blue of the heavens and all that they possess, the roving stars, the moon, the sun's light, brilliant and sublime. Imagine if these were shown to men now for the first time, suddenly and with no warning. What could be declared more wondrous than these miracles no one before had dared believe could even exist? Nothing could be quite as remarkable as this, so wonderful would be the sight. Now, however, people hardly bother to lift their eyes to the glittering heavens. They're so accustomed to the skies. That's why you should let go of any terror of the new. But don't spit out my reason. Weigh with care. If it seems true, what I'm about to say, then throw your hands up and surrender. But if it should seem false, then arm yourself as truth's defender. The mind seeks explanation. Since the universe extends forever out beyond those ramparts at which our world ends, the mind forever yearns to peer into infinity, to project beyond and outside of itself and there soar free.
Yeah, that's very memorable wording. One part of that I stumble over is the part about where it says, nothing is at first so simple, but that it seems hard to understand when it's new. I guess that's the point about that section, is that newness can by itself be disconcerting.
Yes.
But once you get past the newness, what you may find is that the new thing is so absolutely blindingly simple that it becomes commonplace very quickly.
Yes, yeah, I think that's exactly it.
With the example being the stars in the sky, especially at night, how impressive that is when you look at it. But I know I think about that myself whenever I read this passage, that I hardly ever look up at night anymore and look at the stars or the moon.
This reminds me of Wordsworth a bit. The world is too much with us. Interesting when you read these, you kind of wonder, golly, I really wonder if this inspired it. So here I found it. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, are up gathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we're out of tune. It moves us not. It is not exactly the same point, but I wonder if Wordsworth happened to have had Lucretius in mind a little bit.
Yeah, it's very similar, yeah. And of course, the analogy applies to Epicurean philosophy itself, to people who of that time and even today who are just so used to thinking that God's hand is in everything and that everything is divinely motivated. It can seem bizarrely disconcerting to think about that atoms and void can combine and produce the results that we do see. But over time, that's kind of the way we are today. And many of us who have any degree of scientific background at all, we just don't even think about the atoms and the way things work as being miraculous as the religious viewpoint, or
right.
as impressive or as awe-inspiring.
Awe-inspiring. Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Scientific awe is one of the driving forces for scientists. It's that experience of wow. But you need something new most of the time to provoke it.
And Elaine, what is it that you just said? Awe at science. it's pleasure. It's the feeling
Yes,
you get
yes,
from it.
it's
It's not.
it's a pleasurable feeling. Yes, yes.
Yes, it's not. You can't look up at the sky and just say, "Okay, that's the sky." I guess people do that over time. They get
Yeah.
complacent and jaded and cynical. But the heart of it is the emotion or the feeling that you get when you observe these things. Because if you've gotten to the point where you can look at some incredibly majestic sight and just say, "Ho ho." Ho hum, then you're pretty close to the point of death or whatever at that point, I would think.
Right.
Your feelings have been
Boredom
gone.
is a pain. So the novelty is, well, I won't say it's always a pleasure. So it depends on what the novelty is, but we seem to have a need for the pleasures of novelty to some degree. And I like the mind desires eagerly to search into and by its own vigor to range over freely and without abstraction into what's going on out there. That's a pleasure. The pleasure of vigorous inquiry and not being blocked and not being told this is forbidden to think about or talk about.
And some people might want to argue that their attitude of ho hum, I think I'd just like to stay in the bed today. I think I'd just like to sleep the rest of my life away. I mean, that's not that's pretty close to a pain of a certain type, but it's close to death to me as well.
Yeah.
There's so much of an orientation and something we talk about constantly about. You're telling me that this man who sees all these things about the majestic nature of the universe, who sees the pleasure of motion, of all the different things the joy and delight that's possible in the world. You tell me that this man who sees all these things reduces the ultimate goal of life to painlessness? That's just not the direction I can take that. It's not a matter. Go ahead, Charles. You go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say they need to read book 4.
I mean, it's like almost like you can say that to be childlike is can be a negative thing, and it is in some situations, I guess. But just the newness of everything and the enthusiasm that children are associated with of exploring things and just the joy of life that they get out of it. That is it's a feeling. It's not just a book learning kind of experience. It's not something that you just you don't appreciate it without feeling. Basically, is the bottom line.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so his reasoning, to repeat, is that we've seen how the atoms have come together on Earth and produced all the different things that we see here, including the animal creation. And therefore, he is taking the presumption that if it's happened once, it can happen again, and probably has. And so it happens throughout the universe would be his.
Right.
And that means that the rest of the universe is possessed by other kinds of inhabitants, both of men and beasts.
Yeah, I mean that seems very reasonable. I'm not gonna say we can't know for 100% sure, but that seems so reasonable as to be something I wouldn't bother poking at. I think that makes sense. Yeah.
To imply the opposite, that we're sort of special in this regard. It gives more credence to there being a supernatural god or deity or demiurge or something,
Yeah, it'd pretty much have to be that way, wouldn't it? Yeah, I think we're back on solid reasoning ground in this section.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see anything in here that sounds unreasonable.
Martin, are you together with Elaine on that?
Sorry, I dozed off.
I guess the awe of the universe was not sufficient to keep you awake this morning.
Oh my gosh.
Well, you're the one who's in quarantine on the opposite side of the world at a ungodly time of day, probably. So thank you for being here at all.
I was just saying, Martin, that there's nothing here in the basic reasoning process that seems extreme to me. It seems very practical, and I don't have any argument with the reasoning process that he's used in this section. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, we need to be sure this is again something based on logic, and it is only partly justified by observation. So it's something putting up something together which can explain what we see, but it's again not something what we would consider equivalent to what we today consider as proven science.
So then how is it different from, because I thought I didn't see anything in here that seemed like as much of a leap away. I mean, I wouldn't say we definitely know it, but we would think it was probable. It just pragmatically seemed like a reasonable conclusion. But what do you see in there that you don't think that is not in accordance with what we think now?
No, it's not in contradiction what we know today.
Okay.
But at that time, he couldn't really know it.
Right. But even at that time, it seems to me like this is a more practical type of conclusion, that it's not I might be wrong about that. I may be letting current knowledge affect my assessment of what he's done. It doesn't seem to me like he has taken as many leaps as he has in other sections. Or do you think he's taken as many leaps?
No, he's just as a basic level of the model. So he's just taking the primary consequences of an atomistic model. Okay. So if the world is made of atoms and void, then this is what you get.
Yeah. So, maybe it may be me just knowing that he hasn't been contradicted yet that is affecting my assessment of his reasoning process. That's interesting.
Well, that would be like trying to prove a negative. And especially back then, that would be impossible. Even today, we still can't prove it.
Yeah.
This is the continuing question of how do we assess things that we've not been able to observe directly? Do we just draw a bright line and say that because we have not observed it directly, we therefore must hold it to be unproven? Or do we rank things as more probable or less probable even when we have never been there to see it directly?
Well, those two things aren't contradictory. They aren't in conflict. You can say that it's unproven and yet appears to be more probable. So those are not contradictory options. I think that the big thing is to not make an assertion, it has to be this way.
Yeah.
If you don't have evidence. So that's interesting. I guess it is really hard to keep Martin is probably better at keeping those heuristics from affecting his assessment of the reasoning process than I am, because this didn't bother me, but maybe that's just because it hadn't been contradicted.
Well, even then, like you just said, it's not making an assertion that it has to be like this, and how the two statements weren't in contradiction, because in like a system of like atomism, or I guess Lucretius and Epicurus, have already observed and come to the conclusions about the atom. So they're just saying, well, this is, if the world and humans and beasts are made of atoms, who's to say it can't happen elsewhere? So what they're positing that does exist or could exist beyond Earth or the world would just be in a very similar process, if not the exact same. So I think it's just a very standard and like the only possible sort of conclusion that you could draw on it, especially in regards.
Is there in some of the cases where I had a big problem with him taking leaps and not evidence, it seemed to be when he was inquiring into the micro levels, the smaller levels than what we can see. And in this case, he's saying, talking more about what we observe on the macro level. And then, why, even though he does mention seeds, this seems to be more of a macro kind of reasoning process. And I get less irritated by that because it just seems like he is going from things that we observe. But I'm willing to say that I may be using a bias here that I didn't realize.
It's not an easy question to answer, not easy to draw general conclusions about where you draw these lines. To me. Yeah. But maybe that's the ultimate question that we're really wrestling with, because I keep coming back to that in my mind. Is the way I'm organizing it myself is we are necessarily as human beings dealing all the time with questions that we don't have all the evidence we would like to have. And so I'm not suggesting that we have yet defined how to approach that problem, but I think that's what we keep circling around.
So, Martin, would you say, am I way off base here to say that it's a little bit different to make extrapolations about observed macro level processes than it is to make those conjectures about micro level processes that haven't been observed?
Yeah, in some way, yes. The thing is what was against or what we know now in previous sections. This was basically trying to explain in more detail how things happen. Whereas in this section now, it's just looking at the very basic conclusions we get from atomism, and then it is less likely to run into something what is false if atomism is correct at all.
Right. You said it I think that's a better statement of what I was trying to say. So it seems less wild here that he's gone a little bit less further afield, but he does have to. There are some underlying assumptions that atomism.
But how do we describe that question of deciding whether something is less wild or more likely? Is there a way to generalize about that process?
No, I don't know, Cassius. I think you would need to look at particulars, but I think if you compare this to making conjectures about the shapes, the shapes of the seeds and all this kind of stuff that he was doing, there really isn't any evidence to support a lot of what he was doing there. And this, he is sticking more to observe processes. He's not risking getting into quantum stuff that he didn't even know about. He seems to be on stronger ground here because of that. But I don't know that you can make I guess you could say the more conclusions you make that are lacking evidence, the farther away you might be getting from what's really going on. So the fewer leaps that are non-evidence, that might increase your chances of being right. Doesn't mean you will be right, but it seemed like it would increase your chances.
Yeah, he doesn't make any additional assumptions. He just look at the basic things.
Right.
In those false models, he made the basic assumption that the elementary particles behave like rigid bodies which cannot overlap. This is wrong. Yeah. And there are a number of other things which are wrong. But at this level he's discussing now, he doesn't go in that detail. So what he states now doesn't assume a rigid body model for these particles.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. Does that make sense, Cassius? I mean, it's just
I think it does. Yeah, I think it does. In my less scientific and more generalist mind, it basically boils down to a question of quantity and quality of evidence. The more evidence and the better quality that evidence is, the stronger your conclusions that you draw from those are going to be. And it's a sliding scale that when you have less evidence and what evidence you do have is of less quality, then you're much more apt to come out on the short end of the stick and come up with a conclusion that's not correct. So what continues to just interest me is describing, if you were teaching this to a young person or just trying to distill it down into the most general form. I don't know a better way that I can express it right now than just to simply say that the evidence of the senses and the anticipations and the feelings is always got to be your primary starting point, and you want as much of that and as well verified of that as you can possibly get, and you never want to deviate from the evidence that those things do provide.
Yeah.
And you use analogy, you use logical constructs to some extent, but you always have to underpin them and keep them in line with the observations that you do have, which is not something that's easy to do.
And I would say, let's add to that when your conclusions are in part based on analogy and logic, when they're not completely evidenced, be aware of where those spots are. If you know where your points are that you're not finished with yet, that's fine to me. And just state that clearly. Where you get into the weeds is forgetting, what do I have evidence for? What do I not have evidence for? And it seems to me people, when they forget those parts, then they're more likely to go even further and develop even more incorrect conclusions.
And that's about as far as you can possibly get from the attitude of people who say things like, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. And they just take that as a fact of nature and never examine it again, which again takes us back to the opening section from today about no matter how awesome something might be at first glance, you can get used to it, and you have to gird yourself for battle with the things that you believe to be untrue.
Yeah.
And of course, belief is probably the wrong word there. You're trying to reason based on evidence.
Yeah.
And that's the process that
accepting evidence, I think, is maybe a good word to use.
Right. Or I guess the issue really is the conclusions that are drawn from the evidence. I guess if a thing is evident, then that means that the proof is there to some degree. But then the issue is, what conclusions do you draw?
Yeah.
And that's opinion. That's where the error comes in, is the conclusions that you draw from the evidence.
Exactly.
But just because you can draw multiple conclusions from the evidence does not mean that you abandon your faculties of evidence. You can't abandon the senses or your feelings or anticipations, because those are all you have. And if you try to abandon them by saying, well, I'm just going to let God, I'm going to pray about it. Oh my gosh, I'm going to pray about it. Well, you've lost your criteria of judgment when you abandon the only faculties of evidence that nature gave you.
Right.
And although we're not really at the final end of book 2, probably the last passage we have here for today is probably the ultimate conclusion about the nature of the universe and the gods, anyway, because he comes back to the fact that once you understand and accept these things, even though it be new and awesome to you, you can see that nature is not under the heel of gods. Nature is not mandated by gods. And of course, we're part of nature, so we're not under the heel of gods either.
So this last section here today, in today's reading, I think it's really important to remember it's built on prior conclusions about the gods that we've already dealt with. We've decided that there are beings that have maximized pleasure, because we've see that things happen on a spectrum, that some beings are having more pleasure than others, and so we're saying there's somewhere out there are beings that have maximized their pleasure completely, and this has to be the gods, and that they couldn't be enjoying themselves if they were stressing over little human affairs, that we can tell that that's not pleasurable. So here we've got undisturbed bosoms of birds above, blessed with sacred peace, how they live in everlasting ease, a life void of care. And then imagine saying that these gods are having to keep track and make happen everything that's going on in the entire universe that we can't even see, that we think is probably at least as complicated as what we're seeing here on Earth. Is that really sound like something that would be pleasurable? No. So he's bringing in the evidence of our feelings, and along with all of the physics that he's developed so far to make us see how preposterous that kind of idea would be. I really don't even think he has to bring in the infinite universe, because even just the amount of piddly detail there would be in one state or city.
That's right.
Or family. Oh my gosh. You go to Facebook and spend a little bit of time with all this squabbling. I'm like, okay, that would not be fun to micromanage. That's like, wow. But it does really bring home the point. I think he does that effectively.
I see this point made by the commentators pretty regularly, but to me, this is an example of how Epicurus, at least, or maybe the Greeks and Romans in general, but they thought of the gods as being like superhuman people in a sense, but still people, still something they could relate to.
Yeah.
And we don't see people who can manage, like Lynn said, your own household or your city or your town or your state or your country without putting tremendous effort into it. And, I guess I see this as another example of the difference between Epicurean logic and the other type, of where, how do people today just deal with that? They say, well, God's all powerful. Don't you know that? Well, what is the evidence that anything is all powerful? What is that other than just a total abstraction that we assert exists but have no proof whatsoever exists. We can't just, no matter how far out you extrapolate a human being, you're going to have these natural reactions that Elaine's just been discussing about how burdensome or unpleasant it is to do certain things. But just to say that you can answer all those problems by asserting that God is omnipotent and God is omniscient, well, there's no evidence of a spectrum on which you approach that level of abstraction, of being able to embrace all power and all knowledge. That's just a pure word game, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And of course, this he kind of sneaks in or includes a lot of detail in this last paragraph, including the one about how the gods throw thunderbolts and hit their own temples and things like that. I don't know that issue is discussed in detail a lot, but a lot of people use that as an example of the gods obviously not being in total control of their own domain if they are destroying their own temples and their own innocent people, and passing by the guilty and striking dead the innocent and undeserving. That's almost a little bit of an echo of that so-called riddle of Epicurus about how the gods do not deserve respect because of the things that they do or appear to do.
Well, the modern answer to that is just that, who are you, puny mortal, to understand the ways of God?
Yeah.
They managed to get out of that, but in their own minds.
By just asserting the existence of a type of being that we have no knowledge of, no evidence of at all.
That we can't even imagine understanding.
Yeah, that contradicts our own experience.
Who are we to judge? We didn't make it all, so we don't know, and yet we're gonna think that we can. So it's in contradiction with thinking that humans can write a book explaining what that God wants us to do if we're also saying that we can't even really imagine it. So then they say God inspired them to write it, but we couldn't even read it if we didn't.
Right.
Yeah. If we were that far disconnected from understanding the reality of the God, we wouldn't be able to read it and understand it. So it falls apart for me, but it does not for everybody.
Yeah. One of these questions, who can be present at all times and in all places?
Yeah.
That's a very specific example of eliminating the type of supernatural being that we think that lots of people today and for the last thousands of years think is a very real possibility. But when you apply practical reasoning to the question, it doesn't turn out that way. Yeah, this section right here with these series of questions, it does kind of echo in my mind the riddle of Epicurus that is supposedly comes to us through Hume and through one of the church fathers. Well, Martin and Charles, more thoughts for today, or we'll save them for next week and we'll finish book 2 next week. So I think there's a few more sort of concluding remarks that come at the end of book 2, but we are hitting the high point of the discussion about atoms, and at least as it relates to gods over the universe, probably at the end of book 2 here. Well, I am going to have to apologize that today I consider these to be some extremely important and urgent sections, and I think we've done a pretty good job with it today, but I know I've got a cold, so I'm not my enthusiasm level is a little below par today.
Well, I think we've made some important points.
Charles, though, do you have more today?
Yeah, there's nothing too deep within the text that we covered today, so it was much more generalized, and I guess that's more fitting of the beginning of the conclusions of book 2. Yeah,
the books don't always seem to come to an end at what might seem to us to be a logical place, but this one is pretty clearly sort of building to a climax as it approaches the end.
Mm-hmm.
Much easier to understand that we're coming to the end of book 2 than it is to understand the end of book 6 when he starts talking about the plague of Athens. That one just kind of tails off that this one's coming to a reasonable conclusion.
And it doesn't even have a conclusion because it just abruptly cuts off.
That's right. Well, Martin, anything else? We'll begin to wrap up for today. Anything else today, Martin?
No.
Okay. Elaine?
No, I think this is a beautiful section that was poetic and brought several different threads of thinking together, that the parts that we've gone over before, like the gods, to strengthen Lucretius and Epicurus's conclusions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, hopefully I'll be 100% next week and we will conclude book 2. So unless anybody has something else for today, we'll wrap it up.
Nope.
Okay. Elaine, Martin,
All right.
Wrap up?
Yeah, I think I've said everything I can think of on this.
Okay, Martin?
Yeah, also. Thanks.
Okay, very good. See you next week. Thanks a lot.
All right, bye, y'all.
Okay, bye.
Bye.